There is a tunnel under the Cumberland Gap the railroad does not discuss. Men cut it through the mountain in 1888, and in the first decade it fell twice, so the company sent a fresh crew back in to rebore it in the summer of 1897. That crew broke through a shelf of limestone into a chamber no man had cut for the railroad. The resident engineer sealed it the same day, and within the week every man on that crew was on a different line, in a different state, under orders to say nothing. The account survives because one of those men wrote it down 40 years later, and the letter found its way into the Appalachian Dossier. What was inside the chamber cannot tell you entirely, but what the engineer did about it, I can. Before we go any further, do me a favor and look in the description of this video and in the pinned comment at the top of the comments. There is a link there to something I keep called the Appalachian Dossier, a collection of accounts that were quietly removed from official American record between 1843 and 1891. Reports filed by sheriffs and surveyors and country doctors that were burned or locked away or written over by men who decided the public should never read them. I gathered them, and they are waiting for you. If what I tell you tonight makes the back of your neck feel cold, go to that link after the video and read what they tried to keep buried. The Cumberland Gap is a notch in the mountains where 3 states meet, Kentucky and Tennessee and Virginia. And for 100 years, it was the door the country used to walk west. Daniel Boone came through it, and the Wilderness Road came through it behind him. And after the road came the iron. The railroad men wanted a line, out of Knoxville, running up through the gap and out the other side, and the only way to get a train through that ridge was to put a hole clean through it. So they did. Bah! In 1888, the Knoxville, Cumberland Gap, and Louisville Railroad blasted a tunnel through the gap, and the bore finished up in 1889, and for a little while it looked like the kind of thing a company could put in its annual report and be proud of. Then the mountain reminded them it was older than the company and had its own ideas about what stayed open. In the first decade, the tunnel fell twice, the back coming down in 2 separate places, the rock giving way the way old limestone does when a man hollows it out and leaves it to find a new shape. Each time the railroad sent men back in to dig it out and shore it up and make it hold. And each time the work cost more than the estimate and ran longer than the schedule and left the engineers a little quieter than they had been going in. The Gap is limestone country, the kind the geologists call karst, where water has been eating the rock for so long that the ground underneath is full of holes nobody has mapped. The whole ridge is riddled with caves, some of them big enough to walk into, and the stone the tunnelers were cutting through was the same ancient sea limestone that made those caves, laid down hundreds of millions of years before anything with a backbone walked on it. A man drilling into that rock might hit a seam, or a pocket, or a void the maps did not show, and most of the time the void was just a void, a place where the water had been and gone. Most of the time, by the summer of 1897, the job was a rebore, cutting east through the bad section again, to widen it and set a new arch. And a fresh crew had been put on it, under a resident engineer the company had brought down from another line. The work was ordinary, or it should have been, the kind of job a man could do with his hands while his mind was on his supper. That is where this account starts, with ordinary men doing ordinary work in a hard place. The kind of work that only becomes a story because of what the rock had been hiding all along. The engineer's name was Judson Marsh, and he was 44 years old that summer, tall and narrow through the shoulders, with a long sunburnt face and a beard he kept short with a straight razor, whether the camp had hot water or not. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent 20 years inside railroad cuts and tunnel bores, the kind of hands that didn't quite uncurl all the way when they rested on a table. He had a soft voice and almost never raised it, and the men who worked under him said a man could tell Marsh was worried only because he got quieter, never louder, and the quieter he got the more a man wanted to stand a little closer to him. He kept a flat ledger in a tight clerk's hand, and he wrote everything down, The footage advanced, the powder burned, the men on shift, and the writing in that ledger was the steadiest thing about the whole operation. Marsh wanted one thing out of that rebore, and he said it to the crew the first morning, in a way the men remembered later. He wanted the bore done on contract, and he wanted every man he brought in to walk back out of that tunnel when it was. He did not say it like a speech. He said it the way a man states a fact, and the men took it as one, and most of them would have followed him into a harder hole than this one. The crew was small, and it was good. The powderman was a man named Loy Pelfrey, 51, small and careful and dry-handed, the kind of man who had been around dynamite long enough to treat it, the way a carpenter treats a sharp chisel, with respect and without fuss. Pelfrey could read a blast by the sound of it and the smell of the smoke afterward, and he had a rule that he never loaded a hole. He hadn't drilled himself or watched drilled, which is the kind of rule that keeps a powderman alive past 40. The timber boss was Harker Vance, 38, wide through the chest with hands like oak roots, and his job was to keep the roof up, shoring the back with timber, and lagging and tapping the rock with the handle of his hammer to hear what it was thinking. Vance trusted his ears more than he trusted the engineer's drawings, and Marsh let him, because Marsh had seen enough cave-ins to know that the man listening to the rock was usually right. There were drillers, the trade called steel men, who drove the holes with hand steel and sledges, and, where the airline reached, with the new pneumatic drills that coughed and kicked and left a man's arms shaking at the end of a shift. And there were muckers, who shoveled the broken rock into the small cars on the temporary track and ran them out to the spoil bank, which was the hardest, dumbest work on the job, and the one that broke men down the fastest. The youngest mucker on the crew was a boy named Bram Tomley, 19, old enough to be there and quiet about it, a kid who had lied his age up to get the work and kept his head down and his shovel moving. The light inside the bore came from oil wick lamps and candles stuck in clay on the tunnel walls, and from a single carbide lamp on the foreman's cap that threw a hard white cone and left everything beyond it blacker for the contrast. The air was close and wet, and tasted of powder smoke and dead stone, and at the far end of the drift, where the steel was biting into the face, the noise was the whole world. The mules at the portal would pull the muck cars out into the daylight and stop there, and most days a man had to work them back in with a whip and a kind word, which is the way of mules. There were two small things that happened in those first weeks that Marsh wrote down and later wished he had not, because writing them down made them real. The mules, which would always go back in after some arguing, began to stop at a certain point in the drift and refused to go farther, planting their hooves and rolling their eyes at the dark ahead, and no amount of whip would move them past it. And a driller's candle, stuck in the clay of the wall, guttered and leaned in a tunnel where there was no cross-raft to lean it, the flame bending toward the face as if something down there were breathing. Marsh saw it, and Pelfrey saw it, and neither of them said anything about it at the time, which is the way men handle the first sign that a job is going to go wrong. By the third week, the bore had reached the band of harder limestone that Vance had been flagging in the daily report, a shelf of tighter, paler stone that ran across the face like a wall inside the wall. The steel stopped biting the way limestone should, and started to jump and ring flat, the drill skipping off the surface instead of eating into it, and the holes came in slow and shallow and hot. Marsh walked the face himself and put his palm flat against the rock, and the rock was cold where the rest of the bore had been warm, the kind of cold that has nothing to do with the season and everything to do with what is behind the stone. They set a round against the shelf, and Pelfrey loaded it. Light it first, the way a man does when he is not sure what the rock is going to give him. The shot went, and the smoke cleared, and the muckers went in to pull the broken stone, and that is when the first bad thing happened. A slab of the back peeled away without any sound at all, just a slow drawing down of the rock above the face, and it came down across the track where a mucker named Odell had been standing 10 seconds before. Odell had stepped back to spit, which is the kind of small dumb luck that saves a man's life, and the slab buried the car in the track and the lamp he had set on the tie, and missed him by the length of his arm. Vance was through the smoke with his hammer before the dust settled, tapping the back, listening, and Marsh had the crew pulled back to the last set of timber until Vance said it was safe to go in. Nobody was hurt, and the crew trusted Marsh a little more for pulling them out before Vance gave the word. The way a man trusts another, who would rather lose a shift than a man. But the shelf had opened a crack in the face, and through the crack the rock had stopped sounding like rock. Vance put his hammer handle against the face and tapped, and the sound that came back was not the flat dead knock of solid limestone. It was a hollow, almost musical note, the sound a wall makes when there is a room on the other side of it, instead of more wall. A driller broke through the back of his hole a shift later and felt no resistance beyond the steel, the bit pushing forward into empty air, and he pulled it back out and looked at Marsh, and did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that the steel had not already said. Air moved in the bore where no air should have moved, a thin cold draw that pulled the powder smoke the wrong way, back toward the face instead of out the portal, and bent the candle flames toward the shelf the way they had been bending for days. The logic of it was plain, and Marsh knew the logic, because air movement in rock means one of two things. Either there is another entrance somewhere, or the system behind the face is very large, and in this tunnel there was no other entrance. He told himself it was a paleo cave, a dissolution cavity in the karst, a pocket the water had eaten out hundreds of thousands of years before, and left dry and empty, the kind of thing every karst tunnel hits sooner or later and backfills and forgets. He was lying to himself, and he knew it, because a cavity does not breathe like that, and a cavity does not make the mules stop at the same mark every morning. But the lie got him through the shift, and that was enough for the moment. He wrote in the ledger that night in his tight, steady hand that the bore had encountered a harder band of limestone and a small void behind it, consistent with karst, no cause for concern, and he underlined no cause for concern, and a man who underlines that something is no cause for concern has begun to suspect that it is. He ordered a probe round for the morning, a single small hole shot into the shelf to see what was on the other side, instead of the full advance round the schedule called for, and the men knew he was being careful, and they were glad of it, because careful in a tunnel is the thing that lets a man grow old. The probe round went in at first light, a single hole, loaded light and tamped careful, and the shot was a small one, more of a pop than a bang, the kind of round that opens a hole instead of bringing down a face. The smoke thinned and the muckers went quiet, which is the sound a tunnel crew makes when something behind the face is not what the plan said it would be. There was a hole in the shelf now, not a round crater, but a ragged opening about the width of a man's shoulders, and beyond the opening was not stone, it was space. Pelfrey was the first one in, because Pelfrey was the smallest and the most careful, and the man in the crew who knew how to read a blast, and what it left behind. He took the carbide lamp off the foreman's cap and went through the opening with it held out in front of him, and the light went into the space beyond, and did not come back the way light comes back off a close wall. It went away into the dark, as if the dark had room for it. He was in there for the time it takes a man to walk the length of a box car and walk back, and when he came out he set the lamp down on the tie, and he did not look at the opening. He looked at the floor, and his hands were steady, because he was making them steady. Marsh asked him what was in there, and Pelfrey said it was a room, and that the room was dry, and that was all he said, and the way he said it told Marsh more than the words did. Marsh took the lamp from him and went in himself, because Marsh was the engineer, and the engineer does not send men to look at what he will not look at himself, not if he is the kind of engineer Marsh was. The opening gave onto a chamber wider than the bore and higher than a man could reach, and the air inside it was cold and still and very dry, the kind of dry that tastes talk and old time. And the smell was not the smell of wet cave stone, it was the smell of stone that has been dry for a very long time. He raised the lamp, and the light went up and out, and the walls came into view, and the walls were wrong. They were not the rough dissolved walls of a karst cavity, rounded and streaked where the water had run. They were flat. The corners where the walls met the floor and the walls met each other were true as a mason's corner, and the ceiling was even across the whole span of it, and there were no tool marks because there were no tool marks to leave. The surface is smooth the way only water makes things smooth, except that water does not make corners that square. It was a room that had been made, and made by something that did not work the way the men outside the wall worked, and Marsh stood in the middle of it with the lamp, and felt the cold come up through the soles of his boots. He did not name what he was looking at, because naming it would have meant admitting it was there, and he was not ready to do that yet. He brought the lamp down from the walls, and looked at the floor, and the floor was not empty, and that is where the lantern stopped, because the next thing the lamp showed was the thing he would spend the rest of his life not talking about. The floor of the chamber was covered, edge to edge, and what covered it was not rubble, and not water silt, and not the ordinary debris of a cave. It was bone. Human bone, dry and clean and pale as the limestone around it, laid out on the floor in a pattern that no fall of water and no collapse of rock could have arranged, a flat spiral that began at the walls and turned inward to the center of the room, like the whirl of a shell, each bone set against the next, with the care of a man laying tile. The remains were whole where they needed to be whole, and sorted where they needed to be sorted, the long bones paired and the ribs fanned, and the skull set in the turn of the spiral at even spaces, and the whole of it was old enough that the bone had gone to the color of the stone, and the air had dried the last of the marrow out of it centuries ago. Marsh counted the skulls without meaning to, the way a man counts when his mind is trying to make a fact out of something it cannot otherwise hold, and he stopped before he finished, because the number did not help and the counting was making it worse. He did not touch anything. He stood with the lamp and he looked, and the spiral looked back at him the way a made thing looks back, arranged and considered and complete the work of a hand or a thing with a hand that had taken a long time and a steady patience to lay down. The room and the remains were not, he understood, necessarily from the same age. The Gap limestone holds two kinds of old things in it. The ancient sea remains pressed into the rock itself, hundreds of millions of years old, and the much younger things that fell or were put into the caves and the sinkholes later, tens of thousands of years old, still bone and not yet stone. What was on the floor of this room was the younger kind, but the room itself was cut into the older rock, and the two facts did not have to come from the same hand or the same century. And that was the part that stayed with him, that someone had found this hollow and carved it true, and then someone else, later or much later, had come in and laid the dead out in a shape that meant something to them, and to no one living. He backed out of the chamber the way he had gone in, and he did not turn his back to the spiral, which is not a thing a man does when he is looking at geology. Outside in the bore the crew had gathered at the opening without anyone calling them there, the way men gather when the work has stopped being work, and Pelfrey was sitting on a tie with his back to the wall, rolling a smoke, and his hands were not steady now because he was not making them steady any more. Marsh told them to stay out of the room and to stay back from the opening, and his voice was very quiet, which is how the men knew it was bad, and Vance put his hammer down and did not argue, which is how the men knew it was worse than bad. There was a stillness in the bore after that, the particular stillness that lives inside caves and inside the heads of men who have seen something they cannot file, not the silence of an empty room, but the silence of a held breath, and it pressed on them the way the mountain pressed on the tunnel, slow and even and without hurry. Nobody went back in for the rest of that shift. Marsh sat on the last set of timber with the ledger open on his knee, and he did not write anything in it. The first time in 20 years that the ledger had been open and empty in front of him. The lamp on his cap threw his shadow long down the bore toward the opening he had come out of, and the shadow did not move because he did not move, and outside the mules at the portal would not come in past the post. The wrongness did not stay inside the room by the next shift, It had begun to reach out into the bore, the way the cold reached out, and the men felt it before any of them could name it. A driller named Reassigned, who had lingered at the opening longer than the rest, came off shift, unable to say what was the matter with him, only that he did not want to go back down there, and he could not say why, the way a man cannot say why he will not walk past a certain house after dark. He was not hurt, and he was not sick. He was done with that part of the tunnel, and his face had the look of a man who has made a decision with the back of his mind before the front of it is ready. The lamps inside the chamber behaved wrong when a man took one in. Marsh sent Vance in to measure the room, because if it had to be reported, then it had to be measured. And Vance took 2 lamps and a pole, and was in there the better part of an hour. The flames did not flicker the way a flame flickers in still air, with the small wandering of a draught. They leaned, all of them the same direction, toward the center of the spiral, and then they would stand up too straight and too still, as if the air in the room could not decide whether to breathe or to hold. And Vance came out with the measurements, and did not say anything about the lamps, and would not go back in for a second set. The sound, or the absence of sound, was the worst of it. Inside the chamber, the silence was not the silence of a quiet place. It was the silence of a place that was listening, the kind that fills a man's ears until he becomes aware of his own heartbeat, and then aware of the blood in his own skull. And Vance said afterward that the quiet in there was the loudest quiet he had ever stood in. The mules at the portal had stopped coming in past their mark altogether now, and had to be unhitched and let out and replaced with fresh ones, and the fresh ones stopped at the same mark the first ones had, planting and rolling their eyes at the dark, and a man does not have to believe in much to believe that an animal knows a thing before a man does. It was the boy who broke the rule. Brom Tomley, 19 and quiet, went back into the chamber alone in the dead hour of the night shift, when the foreman's back was turned. Whether to see it again or to take something from it, nobody was ever sure, not even Tomley. He was seen going in, and Marsh went in after him. And what Marsh found was the boy standing at the edge of the spiral, with his hand out, and his hand, shaking, not touching the bone, not able to touch it, and not able to pull his hand back, held there the way a man is held at the edge of a high place. The carbide lamp in Tomley's hand went out, not guttered and not dimmed, the way a lamp goes out when a hand closes over it. The dark came in, and the boy came out of it on his own feet, walking backward with his eyes on the floor, and he did not speak for the rest of the night, and he did not go back down the drift again for as long as he was on the crew. He was not hurt. He was finished with that room, and finished is its own kind of hurt, the kind that does not show on the skin. The company superintendent arrived the day after, a railroad man named Garrick, 49, who thought in schedules and tonnage and liability, and who carried a folded copy of the contract in his inside pocket the way a preacher carries his Bible. Garrick had come down because the rebore had stopped advancing, and the daily footage had dropped to nothing, and the ledger had started to say things like void encountered and hold pending instruction, which are the words a ledger uses when the man writing it has run out of words he is willing to put down. Marsh took him to the opening, and let him look in with a lamp, and Garrick stood there for the time it takes a man to do arithmetic in his head, and the arithmetic was not about the room. It was about the contract, and the date, and what it would cost the company if the gap had to be shut while a chamber full of human remains became a question for a coroner, and a newspaper and every man in 3 counties with a shovel and an opinion. Garrick did not say what he was thinking, which was that the cheapest thing the chamber could do for the company was stop existing. Marsh did not say what he was thinking, which was the same thing. The two of them stood at the broken face and did not say it, and did not need to, because both of them had already done the math, and the math came out the same on both sides. To report it was to kill the contract and shut the gap and hold the crew as witnesses for a season, while men with no answers asked questions that had no answers, and to let the room become public was to let something the mountain had kept for centuries become a thing the country argued about over breakfast. To seal it was to lose the room and keep the men and finish the bore, and one of those was a thing a man could live with, and the other two were not, and Marsh knew which one he was going to choose before he admitted to himself that he was choosing. Marsh gave the order the same afternoon, and he gave it to Pelfrey because Pelfrey was the man who would do it right, and he did not give it in writing because nothing about this was going to be in writing if he could help it. The round was not to advance the bore. It was to bring the face down across the opening and seal it, to shoot the shelf back into the hole and pack it and stem it until the wall was solid again. And Pelfrey loaded it the way a man loads a hole he means to never open again, heavy and deep and tamped past the point of overkill. The crew pulled back to the portal, and the shot went, a long rolling deeper sound than an advance round makes, and the dust came out of the bore like weather and settled. And when the air cleared, Marsh and Pelfrey and Vance went back into the face. The opening was gone. Where the hole had been there was only broken limestone, tight and packed and solid. The face closed up as if the shelf had never given way, and Vance tapped it with his hammer, and the sound that came back was the flat, dead knock of solid rock, the sound of a wall with more wall behind it. The room lay behind that wall, and the spiral was in the room, and neither one of them was going anywhere, which was the point. And Marsh stood at the face and looked at the closed stone and did not say anything because there was nothing to say that the stone was not already saying better. Within the week the crew was broken up and scattered, and that part was done fast and done quiet, the way a company does a thing it does not want examined. Pelfrey was put on a train east to a line in the Carolinas, and Vance was sent north to a grading crew in Ohio, and Creasman and the other drillers were split across 2 states. The boy Tomley was put on a surface grading crew, far from any tunnel, as far from a bore as the company could get him. The men were told, in words and not on paper, that what was in that bore was a bad band of limestone, and a void and nothing else, and that they did not need to discuss it, and would not be discussing it, and the way it was said made clear that discussing it was the one thing that would cost a man his job and his reference. The orders came down through Garrick, and the words were Garrick's. But the silence was Marsh's too, because Marsh had chosen it, and choosing it made it his, and a man who has chosen a silence owns it for as long as he lives. The paperwork said the rebore encountered a difficult band of limestone and lost 2 weeks to it, and the footage was made up on the back end, and the tunnel held, and that was the official record, and it was clean, and it was thin, and it said nothing that was true. Marsh wrote the report himself in the same tight clerk's hand he wrote everything in, and he wrote that no artifacts were encountered, and no remains were encountered, and no chamber was encountered, and he wrote each of those once, and then he wrote no chamber was encountered a second time, and underlined it. And a man who writes twice that he did not find a thing he is standing 10 feet from is a man who has begun to suspect that the thing found him. He signed the report, and he filed it, and the report went into the company's records, and the records said the gap was fixed, and that was the end of it, on paper. He did it to keep the men and finish the bore, and that is true. He did it because he could not stand in front of a coroner and a newspaper and an audience of strangers and say what was in that room when he did not know what was in that room himself, and that is true too. Both of them are true at the same time, which is the way a man's reasons work, when the reason is not a reason, but a way of getting through the week. Whether it was the right thing to do is a question the letter does not answer, because the man who wrote the letter did not know either, and he was there, and if the man who was there did not know, then it is not a question this story is going to answer for you. The account comes down to us the way most of the accounts in the dossier come down, through one man who could not keep it past a certain age, and wrote it down before the keeping killed him. Loy Pelfrey, the powderman, was 71 years old when he wrote the letter, living in a rented room in a town in the Carolinas, with his wife dead, and his hands too stiff to load a hole any more, and he wrote it out longhand on the back of a surveyor's form he had kept for 40 years, and he addressed it to no one in particular, which is the way a man writes when he is writing for the record, and not for a person. He named Marsh in it, and he named the boy, and he said that Marsh was a careful man and a good one, the kind of engineer a powder man would work for again. He said that the room was real, and the spiral was real, and that he had not dreamed it and had not made it up. And after that he did not explain the room, because he could not, and a man who has spent 40 years not explaining a thing to himself is not going to explain it to a stranger in a letter. He said what happened to Marsh in the few lines he gave to it, and what he said was that Marsh finished the rebore and the tunnel held, and the company gave him another line, and he took it, and that he never went back down east of that face for as long as he worked, and that he kept the ledger. Pelfrey did not say that Marsh did not sleep. He said that Marsh sat up nights with the lamp on and the ledger open on the table in front of him, looking at the page where the empty space was, the night he came back out of the room and could not write anything. Which is the same thing said the way a man who knew him would say it. Marsh died on another line, of a fever, in 1909, 12 years after the Gap, and the ledger went into a box, and the box went into a basement, and the basement forgot about it, which is what basements do. The room is still there. It sits behind a wall of packed limestone under the Cumberland Gap, where 3 states meet, and the spiral is still in it, and the bones are still dry, and the silence in there is still the same silence, the listening kind, and the railroad does not discuss it and never has. And the men who sealed it are all dead now and have been quiet about it for as long as they lived. What made the room, and who laid the dead out in that shape, the letter does not say, because the letter does not know, and I do not know. And the not knowing is the part you're meant to carry home with you, the way Marsh carried it, the way Pelfrey carried it, the way a man carries a thing he buried because he could not do anything else with it. If you are still with me, tell me in the comments where you are listening from tonight. The town or the road, if there is no town. I read every one of them, and I like knowing who is still awake out there with me. The face Marsh sealed is still solid. Whether he was right to close it back up is the question I will leave with you, because it is the only one that does not have an answer.